Today on Spotlight, we'll be looking into the Viking Society. And we'll be talking with Dr. Frankie and Justin Tyree. Stay tuned. Welcome to this edition of Spotlight. I'm your host, Brook Bortz. Today we'll be looking into the Viking Society here at Sam Houston. Let's take a look.
The Viking Society is the informal name. The formal name is called the Society for Norse History and Culture. We call it the Viking Society for short because we focus specifically on the Viking Age and the Low Middle Ages between AD 793 and 1066. What we do is promote awareness of Viking culture, Norse culture in the Middle Ages. Most of the time when people think of Vikings, they think of the raiders, the marauders, the people who ran around Europe killing people. I mean, there's a lot more to them than that. They were, sons and fathers and mothers and sisters, and they had they had the first democratic society in the Middle Ages in Iceland. And they even penetrated the east as far as the Caspian Sea, and they traded with the Bulgars, they traded with the Slavs, and they traded with the Arabs. So there was much more to them than just the warriors. And what we do is we promote both sides of this culture. So you have a bigger picture, and you have a context, and for which they lived, and which also tells us why they raided, why they did what they did. And so that we do get a better picture. We realize that they were people and they weren't just violent maniacs. They could be relatively peaceful, and they did trade, as I said, as far as east as the Caspian Sea. And many times they assimilated into those cultures that they began trading with. Okay, my presentation is called Finding Greenland. Now first, we have to ask ourselves, what is Greenland? As Dr. Frankie mentioned, sometime around the beginning of the 11th century, there was a Norse settlement established on this continent. Greenland is associated with the first European settlement in North America. About 500 years before Columbus. The first person recorded to have sighted North America, his name is Bjarne Burialson, and it was roughly between 985 and 986. He returned, he was on his way from Norway to Iceland to visit his father, and when he reached Iceland, his father had moved to Greenland. So he asked his crew if they wouldn't mind taking a trip a little further west, and they headed to Greenland and missed it. He was blown off course, got lost, when he sighted land to the west, North American coast. When he finally made it back to Greenland, he told people about what he saw, and Leif Erikson created an expedition to explore the lands. Leif Erikson is the son of the famous Eric the Red. Greenland means Vineland or wineland. Now this is just a map to show Viking voyages. So you can see coming out of Norway and in Sweden, they moved into the east. They occupied the British Isles. They moved into the Mediterranean, and up here in the north, populated Iceland, Greenland, and the settlement that we have up here, which is called Greenland, at Newfoundland, in Lonzo Meadows. Well, the settlement was found in 1960, and it was the first absolute proof that the Vikings occupied North America 500 years before Columbus. Greenland is the settlement at Lonzo Meadows. I believe is part of the greater Vinland. The naming convention used by Leif Erikson in roughly around the year 1000 is he named things by region. So the Markland was forest land. It was a whole region of forested area on the Labrador, what we believe to be the Labrador coast. It doesn't make a lot of sense for Greenland just to be the settlement. What I believe is that the settlement at Lonzo Meadows was just like a northern outpost. where they would receive supplies possibly from Greenland, and it was sort of a waypoint. So it's not necessarily wrong to think of the settlement at Lonzo Meadows as Vinland. It's just, I believe it's just, you need to understand that there's more to it than just that single settlement. There's a bigger picture involved. And the descriptions that we find in the sagas just do not match that settlement. But we know that settlement exists. I mean, it's irrefutable evidence that they were here. We've got the settlement. It's just because it's the only actual, physical evidence of a settlement is why people stick with that being Vinland. But like I said, it's not wrong to consider it part of Vinland. It's just important to realize that there's a bigger picture involved, a larger region. And it was just a permanent outpost, probably between parts of Scandinavia and North America, and maybe anything into the interior of North America was more temporary.
An alternate explanation. There hasn't been, like I mentioned before, there's not been a lot of scholarship after 1980 about the location of Vinland. I mean, once they found that settlement in Lonzo Meadows, they basically said, this is it. We found it, enough said. And much of the scholarship revolved around that central location. But I have an alternative explanation for Vinland and possibly its location. First of all, one of the things that we look at is the names given to other parts of North America, as mentioned in the sagas. Leif Erikson, the first place he saw was, we believe, is Baffin Island, which is just west of Greenland. And he named it Helluland, which basically means flat rock land. And Baffin Island is a strange place geologically speaking, but there's plenty of geologic deformation. It was covered by glacial ice up to 1,500 years ago, as recent as 1,500 years ago. I mean, and when you have glacial ice like that, what it tends to do is it rubs over the landscape and it'll smooth the rock out. And so a lot of the places in in the parts of North America, northern United States, you can see places where the glaciers were moving north and south on along the ground because you got these perfect, these smooth rock formations, and you'll also see carved indentions along with these rock formations that show the movement of the glaciers. And this, so parts, not all the coast, but parts of the coast are exposed. They have the exposed bedrock, and they're smoothed out. And so Baffin Island is kind of both. It's got its flat areas and it's got its mountainous areas, but he named it flat rockland. Now, when he went a little further south, what we think is the Labrador Peninsula, he named Markland, which means forest land. And Labrador is well known for its heavily wooded coastline. Something on the nature of 60% of Labrador is wooded. And then we have Vinland, which is vine or wineland, maybe the St. Lawrence River Valley. This is my theory. And this is, I give you an idea where everything is. So you got Greenland here, and there's Helluland, which is Baffin Island. You got Markland, which is the Labrador coast. And here's Newfoundland right here. And this little part right up there would be where they found the settlement. And so scholarship normally said around this area here. Up here in Newfoundland, and then maybe parts of the coast up here in New Brunswick, and maybe northern Maine.
What we're going to do today, in this particular presentation, is look at this whole question to a certain extent of Vikings and Northmen going into the interior of continents. We always have the impression that they hugged the coast, but Vikings had ships with very shallow drafts and very shallow holes. They could go upriver, and we have examples of that even in the great period of Viking raids in Western Europe. For example, Paris was besieged by a Viking force that went up the Seine River. Cologne was raided on the Rhine, deep in the Rhine, by Viking forces that made it to Cologne via their ships. And probably the greatest example of this, of course, this is the great era of Viking expansion. There's an image of the Viking expansion westward. There are the raids in Western Europe all the way to the Mediterranean. And what I'm going to look at are these eastern routes from the Baltic down the Volga River Valley, usually taking riverine routes, as well as the Baltic down the lower Dvina, up the lower Dvina, down the Dnieper to the Black Sea. Okay? We have abundant historical evidence that this occurred. We have archaeological evidence that this occurred, and we have the fact that, like the case of the Danelaw in England, like the case of Normandy in France, like the development of the modern Scandinavian nations, Russia was in part founded by Scandinavian adventurers. And this is an important thing to keep in mind. We have historical evidence from a number of sources from different points of view that indicate this. We call this the eastern expansion of the Vikings, and you can see these two routes in greater clarity. Okay? They could reach the Islamic world, and they could reach the Byzantine world. And this wasn't the first time that that region of rivers in Eastern Europe was explored by people from the north. 5th century before the great Viking expansion, there was another expansion that occurred. Maybe you heard of the Goths? There were people, a Germanic people, who came from the region of what is today the Baltic. In fact, there's an island called Gotland. You can see an area of Sweden called Gotland there. They probably came from there. They took the riverine routes down to what is today Ukraine and southern Russia. This is around 200 AD. They defeated and broke up the Sarmatian Steppe Confederation, learned cavalry warfare from them. We have records that in the 200s, the Goths made raids, seaborne raids, along the coast of Asia Minor and into the Aegean. Very similar to what we would call the Viking raids. And they adopted horseback cavalry. They became among the finest heavy cavalry in the world, just like the Vikings that settled in northern France became the Normans, among the finest cavalrymen of the medieval West. They eventually played a role in the breakup of the Roman Empire. They served as mercenaries in the Roman army. They defeated the Romans at Adrianople in the 380s. They wandered through much of Europe, eventually settling 2 regions of Europe, setting up 2 successor kingdoms of the Roman Empire, the Ostrogoths, the East Goths in Italy, and the Visigoths in what is today Spain and Portugal. In fact, you will still see Spanish names like Rodrigo that indicate that some elements of the Visigothic experience still exists. So this wasn't the first time that this occurred, but roughly between 800 and 1000, you have this eastward expansion of the Vikings. And according to certain sources from Russia, this was begun by a man named Rurik. Rurik went to the northern end of this route, the Varangian route, came to the northern end of the Varangian route. According to the Russian Primary Chronicle, he helped to organize the Slavic tribes that lived there into what we would say an effective state system. They were actually, according to the Primary Chronicle, he was indeed invited there. And his son Oleg continued this process. This is an image of Oleg by a Palek artist. Palek is a type of art form that is done. The other one's a Western portrait, a modern portrait of Rurik. Oleg continued this riverine exploration until he reached a place in what is today Ukraine and developed Kiev as a trading town or post. In fact, there were there began to be a sort of a relationship. First, there was some violent confrontations between Scandinavians and Slavs. But eventually what happens is you have a beginning of a cooperation among Scandinavians and Slavs along this riverine route. Now, different people have different views as to what happened in how this medieval Russia came about, and we'll talk about those different historical viewpoints. The Scandinavian role in Russian history is a very important one, because what happens as a result of this is that for the first time in the steppe, as far as we know, we have a permanent sedentary civilization emerging in the steppe. Prior to that time, most of the states that had existed there had been steppe empires, ephemeral states that had been developed by nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples.
First of all, I've been studying Germanic languages for a long time. When I say Germanic, that means all of the different older forms of German, like Old Saxon, Old High German, Middle High German, and the Nordic languages. Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish are all a part of the Germanic languages. But I started studying medieval literature in German, and so I had to learn all of these different forms of language. Now, the earliest forms of the Germanic languages are these inscriptions, these carvings that we have found since the 2nd century AD, and up until basically the end of the Viking period, after the year 1000 or so. And so in my training, I've always been interested, in my academic training, I was always interested in the history of the language, the German languages, and so that was my background. Now, when I lived in Oklahoma for 1 year, and it was actually at that time, by chance, that I came across this Rune Stone Park, the Huebner Rune Stone, and I went to visit it, and once I saw it, I got very interested in it, and then did a little bit of research and came across another, perhaps more important stone that has been widely studied for over 100 years, the Kensington Rune Stone in Minnesota. Not only did the Vikings expand westward across the Atlantic, there is some evidence that they may have gone as far as Oklahoma. And there is a rune stone in Huebner, Oklahoma, which I'll be talking about today. So, is it possible that Vikings made it all the way into Oklahoma? In the Poteau Mountains, in southeast Oklahoma, there stands a large slab of savanna sandstone, 12 feet high and 10 feet wide, 16 inches thick, on which a runic inscription has been carved. The inscription consists of 8 letters, or runes, ranging from 6 to 9 inches tall, increasing in size incrementally from left to right. The runic symbols found on this inscription are not found in any writing system used by indigenous peoples from this area, nor do they belong to any of the language systems used by native tribes, for example, the Choctaw or the Cherokee, who were resettled to Oklahoma during the early 19th century. In fact, there is a solid consensus among the scholars who study runiforms that the inscriptions belong to the runic tradition of Northern or Central Europe in the Middle Ages.
You said there are 2 different Norse languages, an old one used for a brief period of time and a newer one used for a lot longer. Given this, around what period of time would you pinpoint this runestone? And is there any possibility that this predates the settlement found in Newfoundland? Okay, let me answer the second part first. It certainly predates the settlement at Lonzo Meadows, which has always for a long time been considered the only actual settlement that we know of, even though it was temporary, in North America. That was around the year 1000. This area called Vinland was discovered
around 985 by by a Viking explorer called Bjarni Herjolfsson, and then it was actually a temporary settlement was set up then sometime around the year 1000. This rune stone, if it can be verified that it belongs to the Elder Futhark, this is sort of a runic alphabet that was phased out starting about the 9th century. We do have evidence from the Elder Futhark rune stones and other carvings that were written with this Elder Futhark as early as the 2nd century. There's fragments of things, but generally from the 6th to the 9th century is considered the time period when this Elder Futhark, this runic alphabet, was used. So it's difficult to pinpoint it based on the linguistics, based on the runes only, any more exact time period. So we could say from the 6th to the 9th century. However, if we add in the fact that the Vikings, the Viking age really started at the very end of the 8th century, is at that point that the Viking ships began raiding along the coast of England, Europe, and began exploring the Atlantic all the way up to Iceland, Greenland, and eventually Vinland, which is this area in North America, along the North American coast. Then we would have to say that by the 9th century, the Vikings would have had the technology, have explored, and had already expanded pretty far westward, and based on the ships they had, the longboats, then they could have come to the coast of North America. And at that time period then, that Elder Futhark, which was being phased out, they also could have used that. So probably between 800 to 850, given those two pieces of information.
But most importantly, Nielsen's research resolved the biggest stumbling block in the scholarship by verifying that all 8 runes can be read as belonging to the Elder Futhark. Thus, the most likely translation of the stone, according to Dr. Nielsen, now reads, as I already gave you, a Glom's Valley, or possibly Glom from the valley. And it is thought that the stone was intended as a boundary marker. For the last 23 years, this has been the most widely accepted translation of the Heavener runestone. Okay, new developments. On April 22nd of this year, the Society for the Promotion of Norse History and Culture conducted a field trip to Heavener, Oklahoma, to conduct research on the Heavener runestone. The group consisted of 9 students, Dr. Richard Nielsen, and myself. And the Vikings, one of the goals in conducting the expedition was to show the students from the Viking class and the Viking Society an example of a runic inscription, which just happened to be a reasonable distance from our present location in Huntsville.
What do you have to say to all those who think the rune stone is fake? Do you have anything to say?
Okay. Well, the one thing that we can tell for certain is that all 8 of these runes do belong to this Elder Futhark, this runic alphabet, which, like I said, went out of date starting about the 9th century. So just based on the linguistics and the proper usage of the letters, the orthography, the spelling, how they're used, we have to say they belong to this alphabet. Now, there is still, of course, a possibility that someone could have, even in the 20th century or even before it was discovered, which would have been at least, we know the stone was there from oral reports of Native Americans in the area, at least since the beginning of the 19th century. Okay. So at that point, in the beginning of the 19th century, someone could possibly have gotten books or that had this runic alphabet in them and used them and lifted them out of whatever book they had and then carved them on the stone. Okay. However, this seems very unlikely because, first of all, if it's a hoax, if someone was just doing this as a hoax, it's important for hoaxers to announce to the world their discovery so that people can come and look at it. This never happened back in the 1830s that we know
Also, another reason it seems unlikely is the fact that the carver of the stone was using the known methods of carving, just like rune stones that are dated to this time period in the from the 6th to 9th century in Sweden. And one of the interesting things is that these carvers would often put runes backwards, and they sometimes used runes different forms for the same letter.
Okay.
Now, if you can imagine someone who wanted to create a perfect hoax, a perfect forgery of a rune, unless they really knew a lot about how these runes were carved, they probably would not think of putting two different runes for the same letter. And in fact, that would be very risky, because if you want to create a forgery, you want to create a perfect forgery. So, again, we can't prove this absolutely, but it just seems unlikely that the carver would have been in the mindset of a modern-day person who was doing a forgery. It seems more likely that this person knew the way the runes were actually carved and followed the same way of writing these runes by using two different runes for the same letter. So in my mind, at least, that gives us more evidence that this probably was authentic.
Okay, so I'm sure you've heard about this, but a map of Greenland was found in the 50s, and it was likely believed to be fake by many scholars. Do you believe it's possible that the Rune Stone in Oklahoma it could have been faked as well?
A lot of scholars believe that the Heavener Rune Stone is a fraud, that it was faked. But evidence that we've collected recently over the past several months starts to point away from it being a fake. There's a number of things. For instance, the way that the language, the runic language, how it was carved, is so detailed that someone would have to know the language. The runic language is a vernacular. There wasn't a standard alphabet, a standard language. And what the people did, the Vikings did during the Middle Ages, is they tried to recreate sounds that they were speaking in this runic. So those can change depending on the region. You've got different dialects. And typically when someone is making a fraud, they want it to be perfect so it won't be questioned. Well, this isn't perfect. And the subtle differences are so tiny that someone would have to be familiar with the language, very, very familiar. They couldn't have just picked up a book and say, oh, I can do it this way, because it would have been perfect, and it's not perfect. Another thing is the stone is, it's a large piece of sandstone, and it rates a 7 out of 10 on the Mohs hardness scale, which means it's very difficult to carve in there. So somebody on a Sunday afternoon couldn't have gone, I feel like making a fake, and just tapped it into the stone. It took a long time and some significant skill with a hammer and chisel to carve this. Even as simple as the inscription is, it took some time. So if somebody were to make it make a fake, they would have to be really, really dedicated to it. There was one man who went out there, and he went behind the stone, and he took a tire iron and a large rock, and he started hammering into the stone to get an idea of how easy or how difficult it would be to carve into the stone. He spent 30 minutes hammering on this with a tire iron, and he only created a marking about the size of a dime, and for a dime to sit in. So after 30 minutes. So this would have taken somebody who wanted to make a fake quite a bit of time to carve. There's only 8 runes, but they're fairly large, and the stone is so difficult, somebody had to be really dedicated to carve it. And so that kind of leads away, that plus the fact that the language, that the runes used in the inscription aren't perfect, leads away from it being a fake.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Spotlight. I hope you enjoyed the program just as much as I did. Hope to see you again next week. I'm Brooke Bortz. Have a good night.